By May of 1893, in a temporary hall on the fairgrounds of Jackson Park in Chicago, visitors filed past a room that was not quite a room at all, but the inside of a tree. The General Noble tree had arrived from the Sierra Nevada the previous year, a giant sequoia cut into segments, hollowed, and reassembled as a walk-through house for the World's Columbian Exposition. Inside, electric light washed over the pale, ribbed grain of its interior walls. Outside, a neat printed label reduced 3 millennia of growth to a few lines of text. The official story was simple: science, spectacle, national pride. But the images from that summer carry a quiet contradiction. In Chicago, the tree stands upright, reconstituted as an attraction. In California, the stump left behind sits in a basin stripped of its ancient giants. History remembers progress, but forgets what it replaced. In the spring of 1853, in the Calaveras Grove of the Sierra Nevada, California, a crew of men began cutting into what newspapers would soon call the Discovery Tree, a giant sequoia, more than 20 feet across at the base. The place is precise. A high basin reached from gold rush camps, the air still carrying the metallic tang of smelters and the resin of untouched forest. After weeks of labor with augers and long saws, the tree fell, and its stump was planed smooth to host dances and gatherings. Later photographs show women in long dresses standing where growth rings once carried sap upward. Sections of bark and trunk were prepared for shipment to eastern cities. Contemporary reports describe crowds marveling at the mammoth sections and counting growth rings to estimate an age of more than 1,000 years. The tone is proud, almost triumphant America, demonstrating its natural wonders. The permits, the advertisements, the travel accounts all align. The tree was felled to prove a point and to make money from tickets. Yet certain details persist in the archive: the bright curls of sawdust piling at the base, the way forest light changes once the canopy opens. A century and a half later, tourists still stand on that same stump in Calaveras Big Trees State Park. In satellite images and drone footage, it reads as a perfect circular scar, a single, flat ring, in a landscape that once held columns. Some modern viewers see in this scene the first cut in a global pattern. Others see only the documentation of curiosity. The question that hangs between those interpretations remains unanswered. Why did proof require destruction? By 1855, the story shifts to New York City and the iron and glass volume of the Crystal Palace at what is now Bryant Park. There, visitors stepped into an exhibit billed as a vegetable wonder, the hollow cylinder of bark from another Calaveras giant, later named Mother of the Forest. Over 90 days, workers had stripped some 60 tons of bark in 8-foot sections from the living tree, up to a height of more than 30 meters. Reassembled in New York and then in London's Crystal Palace, the bark formed an empty tower the public could walk through, a wooden echo of the iron and glass vault that housed it. Official pamphlets emphasized statistics: height, circumference, an estimated age of around 2,500 years. They reassured visitors that the exhibit represented progress in science and industry. The archival tension here is not in the numbers, but in what followed. When the Crystal Palace at Sydenham burned on the 30th of December, 1866, the bark of Mother of the Forest burned with it. In Calaveras, deprived of its insulating bark, the stripped trunk slowly died and was later further damaged by fire in 1908. The same century that created techniques to preserve specimens also arranged inadvertently or not for their erasure. A structure removed from its living context to prove its existence ended as smoke. On the present-day trail in Calaveras, the remaining snag stands blackened and silent. Saw marks are still visible along its flanks. Wind moves through the empty core with a faint pipe organ tone, a natural acoustics that survives where bark once shielded heartwood from weather. The dates are stable, the records consistent. The mystery lies not in missing paperwork, but in the choice itself, to turn living giants into travelling shells, and then to watch them burn. In 1876, on the grounds of the Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia, A massive ring of sequoia bark and wood stood among the displays of industrial and national progress. It had been cut from a huge tree in what is now Kings Canyon National Park and shipped across the continent to mark the United States Centennial. The official label presented it as evidence, a physical demonstration of the scale of California's forests. Yet many visitors refused to accept that the fragment came from a single tree. Accounts recall that the exhibit was dubbed the California hoax, a phrase that stuck. Here, the archival contradiction is explicit and documented. Engineers and botanists insisted the ring was genuine. Much of the Eastern public thought it a trick. The gap between expert testimony and popular belief is frozen in articles and letters. In the photographs that survive, people stand at the base of the reconstructed cylinder, dwarfed by its size. Their names are mostly unrecorded anonymous silhouettes leaning against a vertical cross-section of lost time. One guidebook notes only that ladies from a nearby logging camp later held Sunday school on the Stump when it returned west and became the Centennial Stump. Back in California, the original grove was being rapidly logged. By the 1870s and 1880s, companies in the Kings River region were felling thousands of sequoias, leaving only scattered survivors like the General Grant tree. Some later writers would point to this moment when proof of the giants was laughed off as a hoax, as one of the reasons promoters pushed for even more spectacular exhibition trees. They had to cut deeper, make the evidence more overwhelming. The dates in the archive are clear. What remains unresolved is the impulse behind them, how disbelief about trees became justification for destroying them. By late 1892, in Converse Basin, California, loggers began the weeks-long process of felling the General Noble tree, a giant sequoia whose stump would later be known as the Chicago Stump. The basin was already crisscrossed with skid roads and chutes. Sawdust drifted into the cold mountain air. The plan was not just to cut the tree, but to turn it into architecture. Sections of trunk were hollowed, fitted with doors and windows, and shipped by rail to Chicago, where they were reassembled inside the forestry building of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition as a fully furnished interior, the house that grew. Official fair literature celebrated the feat as a symbol of California's resources and American ingenuity. The white city around it, with its bright neoclassical facades, was itself largely built of timber frames, clad in staff, plaster and fiber composite, designed specifically for temporary expositions. The buildings were meant to impress and then vanish. The archival tension lies in the contrast between permanence and planned obsolescence. In the forest, General Noble had stood for over 1,000 years. In Chicago, its reconstituted interior was designed to stand only a few months. The fair closed on the 30th of October, 1893. Within years, most of its buildings were demolished or destroyed by fire. Photographs show visitors standing inside the treehouse, touching the polished growth rings on the floor. On one print, attributed to photographer C. Curtis, 50 men pose on the stump before disassembly, their boots arranged along the enormous circular edge, an image that survives in archives, while their names do not. Today, the Chicago Stump remains in Converse Basin, a solitary weathered disk in a largely second-growth landscape. Nearby, straight lines of younger trees mark former skid trails, like ghost railways through the forest. The freight manifests exist. What feels missing is a line in any official report acknowledging the scale of what was lost. In 1891, in the big stump grove of what is now Kings Canyon National Park, another sequoia was selected for sacrifice. Later called the Mark Twain tree, it stood around 300 feet tall with a trunk about 16 feet in diameter. Loggers took nearly 2 weeks cutting through its base. Photographs from the time show men posing on the horizontal trunk and on the enormous stump images that would later be used to promote both lumber companies and scientific displays. Sections of the trunk were shipped to the American Museum of Natural History in New York and to the British Museum in London as exhibition pieces. The rest of the wood was milled into grape stakes, fence posts, and shingles. The official reasoning echoed earlier cases. Skeptics doubted that trees of such size really existed, and museum displays would serve as permanent proof. Here, the archival tension lies between permanent proof and disposable timber. One part of the tree became a museum exhibit meant to educate generations. The remainder was treated as ordinary lumber. An 1890s report described the tree as more than 1,300 years old. Based on ring counts, the stump that remains is now part of the Big Stump picnic area, surrounded by interpretive signs and walking trails. In the archival photographs, you can almost hear the metallic ring of tools against steel wedges, the dull thud of falling sections. Later, in the museum halls, visitors' footsteps click across polished flooring as they read timescales marked on the cut surface. The conflicting timestamp in this chapter emerges when comparing sources. Some popular accounts over the decades inflated the tree's age towards 2,000 years, while dendrochronological estimates based on remaining sections suggest about 1,300 to 1,500 years. The uncertainty is small in geological terms, but it underlines how a single living chronology was converted into multiple narratives. In the present, the Mark Twain stump is a tourist attraction and a lesson in conservation history. While American sequoias were being felled for exhibitions and lumber, another story of giant trees was unfolding around the eastern Mediterranean. In the high slopes above Pshari, in what is now northern Lebanon, the cedars of God, remnants of once vast cedar forests, were shrinking fast. For millennia, Lebanon cedars had been prized for shipbuilding, temples, and monumental architecture. Ancient texts and travelers' accounts alike describe them as trees of extraordinary height and girth. By the 19th century, only small fragments of the original forests remained. The Ottoman Empire, facing the railway age, used cedar timber for sleepers and fuel, accelerating the loss. A precise human trace survives in stone, Roman Emperor Hadrian's boundary markers, carved with inscriptions to protect certain cedar groves as imperial reserves. The dates on those stones, 2nd century of the Common Era, stand in stark contrast to 19th century records, noting that by 1876, the main protected cedar forest covered only a little over 100 hectares, later enclosed by a wall funded to keep out grazing animals. There is no hidden archival conflict here. The documentation is painfully clear. Centuries of overexploitation, culminating in industrial rail demands and wartime use, reduced ancient forests to isolated stands. Wind moves through sparse cedar branches, the clack of trains passing over timber sleepers far below. In period photographs, the cedar groves appear like islands, dark crowns in a landscape, already showing terraces, roads, and cut slopes. The contradictory timestamp emerges in cultural memory. Ancient stories, such as those in the Epic of Gilgamesh, imagine cedar forests, so extensive they form a mythic battleground. 19th century forestry reports detail remnants measured in hectares. Both accounts are true to their time, yet the scale has inverted. Modern travelers stand under the surviving cedars of God and often compare them to cathedral columns. The analogy recurs across centuries. The archives confirm the cutting. They are silent on any deeper intent. By the late 19th century, the pattern of cutting giant trees was no longer local or symbolic. It was systemic. Railways and telegraphs, spreading across continents, required immense quantities of timber not just for sleepers and bridges, but also for the utility poles carrying wires. In British India, 19th century analyses of Himalayan forests noted that rail expansion had driven large-scale felling of conifers for sleepers and fuel, transforming slopes in just a few decades. In Russia and Eastern Europe, selective logging for profitable species like pine, combined with unmanaged cutting, gradually reduced old-growth stands. Forestry, as a science, emerged in this context, promising rational management and sustained yield. Government documents from the late 1800s celebrated inventories, management plans, and experimental plots. Yet other archival voices, including early 20th century critics in Russia and elsewhere, warned that if forest affairs continued to be run as they had been, nothing would be left. The artifact here is not a single log, but the telegraph pole itself. Starting in the 1840s, lines in Britain and America used rows of wooden poles to carry wires. Photographs of 19th century rail corridors show long files of truncated trees, stripped of branches and bark, recast as silent conduits for electrical messages. The recurring sound motif sharpens. The faint, high whine of wind in telegraph wires, the click of Morse keys, the rumble of trains on wooden sleepers. The forest's verticality had been regimented into evenly spaced poles, each one a standardized residue of a felled trunk. Maps from the early 1800s depict vast continuous forests across Siberia, Eastern Europe, and North America. By the late 19th century, atlases and forestry reports divide the same areas into managed compartments, concessions, and degraded lands. The land itself has not moved, but the conceptual grid laid over it has changed. Modern satellite imagery still reveals scars, linear clearings where rails and roads run, dendritic patterns of old logging roads fading into regrowth. Between 1893 in Chicago and 1900 in Paris, a series of World's Fairs staged a vision of modernity in gleaming palaces and domes. To visitors, these structures looked like stone, stately, permanent, classical. In the archives, their construction details tell a different story. Most of the principal buildings of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, including the Court of Honor, were built on temporary wood and steel frameworks, clad in staff, a plaster-like mixture of gypsum, cement, and fibre, and painted white. The Exposition Universelle of 1900 in Paris used similar techniques for many of its pavilions, erecting elaborate facades along the Seine, with the understanding that most would be demolished after the fair closed. The official narrative celebrated these as triumphs of engineering efficiency. But from the perspective of material history, they represent a curious inversion. Timber and plaster imitating stone, temporary shells pretending to be eternal monuments. Inside these buildings, visitors heard the echo of their footsteps on wooden floors and the murmur of electric dynamos outside. The structures looked like masonry cathedrals, but sounded like lightly built halls. The contradictory timestamp appears in planning documents and later histories. The fairs were framed as summaries of the 19th century, even as they were built on materials designed to last only months. A century of progress was thus represented by structures with lifespans shorter than a single winter in the mountains where sequoias and cedars had stood. At the same time, older monumental architectures built on massive stone and wood frameworks were being demolished or reinterpreted around the world. New old palaces were erected temporarily, only to be wiped away. The fair's electric lights and experimental machines introduced a new kind of invisible infrastructure, while the material shells that housed them vanished almost without trace. The archival record does not support claims of hidden technologies. It does, however, document a global shift towards spectacle, built on expendable timber, a kind of planned amnesia for architecture. Beginning in the 1840s, with early telegraph lines along Britain's Great Western Railway and the Baltimore to Washington route in the United States, wood entered a new technological role as the standardized vertical supports for an invisible network. By the late 19th century, telegraph and early telephone lines spanned continents, their poles often made from straight trunks of pine, cedar, or other softwoods. Photography from the period shows rows of poles receding into perspective along tracks and roads, carrying sagging wires that sang in the wind. Official technical manuals discuss insulator types, wire gauges, and grounding techniques. They are largely silent on the origin of the poles themselves, beyond specifying suitable species and treatments. Yet each pole is, in effect, a processed fragment of a former forest. The sound motif comes into sharp focus here, the metallic chirp of Morse signals, the low hum of wires in gusts, the creak of timber poles shifting in frost. Contemporary observers remarked on the eerie noises telegraph lines made in storms, a kind of artificial aeolian harp stretched across territories. The contradictory timestamp arises when comparing early telegraph diagrams with later grid maps. In the 1850s, lines are drawn as singular feats linking a handful of cities. By the 1890s, encyclopedias portrayed dense webs of interconnection. The expansion is staggering, and each additional line translated into more wood-cut, seasoned, and set upright in straight intervals. Modern infrastructure has largely replaced wooden poles with concrete and steel in many regions, but remnants of 19th century wooden poles survive along some rural rail lines and rights of way. The archives corroborate the physical facts: dates of line openings, volumes of timber consumption, photographs of poles in snow and dust. They do not explicitly comment on whether humanity was aware of the symbolic exchange taking place. Forests converted into the skeleton of real-time communication. On the other side of the globe, in the North Island of New Zealand, another class of giant trees was being cut, this time not for exhibition so much as for imperial infrastructure and commerce. Kauri forests once covered large parts of northern New Zealand, with individual trees reaching impressive girths and ages likely extending over millennia. In the 19th century, as European settlement expanded, kauri timber became highly prized for shipmasts, spars, and building. Kauri gum was also harvested intensively. Between roughly 1820 and 1900, estimates suggest that more than 90% of the original kauri forests were logged or burned, with logging peaking around 1907. A later forestry summary notes that by 1900, less than 10% of the original forest remained, and today only a few percent of uncut forest survives in small pockets such as the Waipoua forest. The human trace here is unusually clear. Petitions, such as the 1947 Waipoua State Forest petition wheeled into the New Zealand Parliament, demanded protection for the last virgin. Kauri stands a direct, documented response to the previous century's mass felling. In Waipoua forest today, trees like Tana Mahuta and Te Matua Ngehere, massive living kauri, estimated at between roughly 1,250 and perhaps over 2,000 years old, stand as survivors of that wave of exploitation. Visitors approach them on raised walkways, under signs warning of disease and urging respect. The sound motif in this chapter is softer: the drip of water in dense, humid air, the distant call of birds, the muted thud of footsteps on boardwalks constructed to protect shallow roots. Where 19th century logging camps once rang with axes and saws, the forest now is held in a carefully maintained quiet. The cutting of kauri is thoroughly documented in shipping records, sawmill logs, and land surveys. What remains to be reconstructed, often only through fragments, is the acoustic and visual world that vanished when those forests fell. By the early 20th century, the most visible signs of 19th century tree felling were not towering trunks, but what was left behind: stumps, snags, and oddly isolated giants. In California, visitors to Calaveras and Kings Canyon walk past the Discovery Tree stump, the Chicago stump, and the Mark Twain stump leveled platforms where once crowns caught lightning and snow. In Lebanon, the Cedars of God stand as a small island of old trees surrounded by younger forest and human settlement, ringed by a protective wall. In New Zealand, the Waipoua forest preserves kauri, surrounded by a landscape heavily altered by logging and agriculture. The sound motif here is absence, the difference between walking under a continuous canopy and along a trail bordered by isolated relics. A peculiar, documented modern twist appears in geological formations like Devil's Tower in Wyoming. Some online groups and alternative writers have claimed that such volcanic intrusions are actually the petrified stumps of impossibly giant trees, a view widely rejected by geologists and explicitly debunked by the United States National Park Service and independent fact-checkers. The archival contradiction in this chapter is not between contemporary scientific sources which agree that Devil's Tower is an igneous intrusion, but between established geology and modern internet folklore. The dates of Devil's Tower's formation, on the order of tens of millions of years, do not align with any human history. The giant tree stump hypothesis belongs firmly to speculative myth. Yet the visual rhyme is powerful. To a viewer primed by the sight of sequoia stumps large enough to support dozens of people, the idea that even larger stumps might exist in stone can be emotionally compelling. Where the last giant trees were cut, their stumps sometimes became dance floors, platforms, or improvised stages. Where geology produces flat-topped columns, people now project lost forests onto them. The archives confirm only part of this. The photographs of real stumps, the measured diameters, the descriptions of dances on their surfaces, the geology of volcanic plugs. By the early 21st century, the fragments of this story, archival photographs, digitized forestry reports, scanned fair catalogues, and tourist snapshots, had migrated into a new kind of forest, the internet. On video platforms and forums, compilations of 19th century images circulate: workers standing on sequoia stumps, exhibition trees in glass halls, trains passing through stripped valleys, lone cedars behind stone walls, kauri trunks loaded on ox-drawn wagons. Many of these images come from institutional archives, national parks, libraries, museums, where they are catalogued simply as records of logging, exhibitions, and early conservation. In parallel, communities discussing alternative histories have adopted some of the same images as visual elements in broader speculative narratives. The official record does not support such conclusions. It does, however, contain many silences, missing names of workers, incomplete logs of timber volumes, unexplained gaps in photographic series, and, as seen with the Crystal Palace fire, literal destruction of key exhibits. The human trace in this chapter is often just a signature at the bottom of a negative sleeve or a brief caption in an old catalogue. Photographer C. Curtis, for example, left glass plates showing sequoia felling scenes that were nearly lost until descendants preserved them. The contradictory timestamp comes from how digital copies flatten time. A photograph from 1891, a satellite image from today, and a modern comment appear on the same screen, stripped of their original context. The historian's task is to hold pattern and proof apart. The archives confirm large-scale 19th century deforestation, driven by economics, empire, and technological change. They register human awe and regret. They do not document a coordinated program to erase a prior civilization. The silence between what is documented and what is imagined is precisely where modern myth grows. In the present, the camera returns to physical places. A tourist in Kings Canyon stands before the Mark Twain stump, reading a plaque that summarizes the events of 1891 in a few sentences. Children run across the flat surface, their footsteps echoing faintly inside the hollowed soil where roots once spread. Another visitor walks the loop trail in Calaveras, pausing before the charred remains of Mother of the Forest, now a fire-blackened column with visible saw scars. The air smells of resin and leaf litter. Distant road noise blends with bird calls. High on Mount Lebanon, a guide leads a small group through the cedars of God, pointing out protective walls, younger plantings, and the oldest remaining trunks. Some of these trees now stand as national symbols, appearing on flags and coins instead of in shipyards and railway yards. In Waipua Forest, visitors approach Tana Mahuta in near silence, instructed to clean their shoes and avoid straying from the boardwalk to protect roots and prevent disease. Rangers sometimes speak in low voices about the tree's estimated age and the history of logging that left so few like it. The recurring sound motif resolves into a kind of layered quiet: wind in old branches, far-off vehicle noise, an occasional distant hum from power lines crossing nearby hills. The contradictory timestamp in this final chapter is between the deep time embodied by surviving giants, centuries to millennia, and the very recent decisions to protect them, many dating only to the mid-20th century or later. From one angle, the reason the 19th century's giant trees were cut down is straightforward: timber, profit, proof, and the material needs of railways, ships, mines, and growing cities. The archives support this unequivocally. The frame holds, then flickers. The reel ends not with an answer, but with that unresolved image: one survivor, one network, and the space between them where a lost canopy used to be.